Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Let the adventure begin. Every like brings us closer to the truth. Subscribe before the next case disappears in the dark. Miss Marple and the Missing Marmalade. Recipe Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. It was the sort of May morning that made one believe in the goodness of life. The sun filtered through high, lace-trimmed clouds and settled gently on the lawns of St. Mildred's Church Hall, where tables were being laid for the annual spring fete. Women in floral hats bustled about with trays of scones and tartlets, and the men, few as they were, stood self-consciously near the tea urn, offering to carry things they knew perfectly well would be refused. Miss Marple, in a pale lavender cardigan and her straw hat pinned just so, was seated at a modest table selling embroidered tea cozies. She'd knitted each herself, of course, not for profit. No one in St. Mary Mead ever made a profit at these things, but for the quiet pleasure of being useful. "It's all rather charming," murmured Mrs. Davenport, adjusting her pearls as she approached. "Though I do miss the marmalade competition. It gave the event a bit of, edge." Miss Marple smiled politely but did not comment. Everyone knew why the marmalade contest had been quietly removed from the program. Last year's scandal involving Mrs. Simons's suspiciously store-bought entry and Mrs. Redfern's public accusation of marmalade fraud had left a sticky residue over village relations. Still, it was hard to think anything dark could touch such a sun-dappled day. That illusion lasted precisely until Mrs. Redfern collapsed face first into her own Victoria sponge. At first there was confusion. Someone cried out, someone else laughed, nervously, thinking it a feint. The vicar's wife fumbled for spelling salts, but by then the small crowd had surged forward. Miss Marple stayed seated, blinking with sharp concern behind her spectacles. "She's not breathing," gasped Edith Wells, kneeling beside the body. "I think she's—" "Oh heavens!" Dr. Graham, summoned from his stall selling garden rhubarb, took only moments to confirm it. "Dead," he said simply, rising. "Gone instantly, I should say. Massive cardiac arrest or, well, something of that nature." There was a flutter of gasps. "Oh, how terrible," murmured Mrs. Finch, and she was only just saying how excited she was to debut her sponge recipe, said it was based on her grandmother's. Miss Marple, still in her seat, listened to this carefully. A sponge recipe, was it? Debuted today? And yet, she thought, how curious. Mrs. Redfern never shared recipes, quite the opposite. Only last week she'd shooed poor Nora Prentice out of her kitchen for asking about the very same sponge. A slight chill crept into Miss Marple's thoughts, despite the warmth of the day. The police, summoned from the nearby town of Much Benham, arrived within the hour, tramping across the grass with apologetic boots and tired expressions. Constable Brent took the lead, scribbling in a little pad as villagers repeated the same thing. Mrs. Redfern had simply collapsed. No sign of struggle, no raised voices, nothing suspicious. It must have been the heart, poor dear. But she had no history of heart problems, noted Dr. Graham later, as he quietly conferred with Constable Brent near the jam store. In fact, she was annoyingly robust, walked 5 miles a day, range or shine. Miss Marple overheard this, of course. One didn't need to eavesdrop in a village fete. One simply had to sit still long enough. The information floated to her like dandelion fluff. By evening, the fete had been abandoned. The tables were half cleared, bunting sagged like mourning ribbons, and the vicar's wife was still gently sobbing into a tea towel. Miss Marple, returning home, paused at the corner of High Street and looked up toward the Redfern home, an imposing, Georgian structure with lace curtains and a rose garden Mrs. Redfern had once boasted about to a visiting gardening columnist. The windows were dark now. The house, like the fete, felt silenced. But what struck Miss Marple most was something far smaller. Earlier that morning, before the fete had opened, she had walked past Mrs. Redfern's table, just a quick peek, and she had noticed a covered dish, guarded as though it contained royal treasure. She remembered Mrs. Redfern saying to someone, "It's a surprise. I guarantee no one's tasted anything like it." And now that dish was missing, not packed up, not broken, simply gone. An ordinary cake, perhaps, or perhaps not. The next morning brought no clarity, only more speculation. The coroner's report would take days, perhaps longer, and in the meantime, the village did what villages do best. It theorized. She was always high-strung, said Mr. Penhaligon, the butcher. Never trusted a woman who didn't eat her own bacon. She was eating her cake, said Mrs. Finch, voice low. But she gave that first slice to Mr. Redfern. This caused a pause. "And he's perfectly fine," added Miss Templeton, from behind a pile of newspapers at the post office. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in her garden with a pot of Earl Grey, and her knitting needles clicking gently. She wasn't jumping to conclusions, but she was, in her own way, performing a kind of autopsy. Of the event, not the body, it wasn't. Just that Mrs. Redfern had died. It was when, how, at what, vanished in the aftermath, and of course, there was the marmalade, not actual marmalade, mind you, but the missing recipe. Everyone had been talking about it for weeks. Mrs. Redfern, for the first time in her life, had promised to share her grandmother's famed bitter orange marmalade recipe at the fete. Her way of mending fences, perhaps, after last year's disgrace. But it had never materialized. There'd been whispers she planned to write it down and pin it beside the sponge cake. No recipe was ever found. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Sometimes, you see, it's not just the body that goes missing. Sometimes it's the one thing everyone was meant to find. And that, she thought, is rather suspicious indeed. Chapter 2. The Village Buzzes. By mid-morning the next day, the heart of St. Mary Mead pulsed not with mourning, but with murmurs. Though High Street, though hardly bustling on any given weekday, had adopted a curious rhythm. Half pauses in conversation, subtle tilts of the head, glances that lingered just a second too long. At the grocer's, the draper's, and most pointedly at the post office, people were not so much discussing Mrs. Redfern's death as circling it, like cats around a closed door. "It's always the strong ones that go, isn't it?" Mrs. Finch remarked, selecting apples from a basket outside Stubbins' grocery. "Walked every morning at 6. Rain, snow, sleet, never missed a day. Too much exertion, if you ask me." "Or maybe not enough," replied Mr. Barnes, the greengrocer, with an air of knowing something others did not. "Strange thing, though. My wife said she saw her arguing with someone near the rectory the morning of the fete. She wouldn't say who." "Arguing?" Mrs. Finch's brows rose like sails. "With whom?" Mr. Barnes lowered his voice and leaned in. "Didn't say. My barrel swears it was heated." The word heated passed quickly from one mouth to the next, until even the vicar's cat might have known Mrs. Redfern had supposedly quarrelled before her death. At the centre of the village square, Miss Marple sat on her usual bench, a delicate skein of yarn in her lap, half-knitted and wholly forgotten. She wasn't one for direct questioning, no need to muddy water when one could simply watch for the ripples. Instead, she listened as the villagers brought their theories to her unbidden, as though seeking confession from someone who would never interrupt. "It's the husband, if you ask me," murmured Nora Prentice, seated beside her with a bag of sugar on her knees. "Grief suits him far too well. He was at the butcher's this morning, asked for steak." "Steak, Jane, the day after his wife dies." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Some people grieve in strange ways, dear. Others simply get hungry." Nora blinked. "Still, it's unseemly I'd be in bed, clutching a pillow if it were me." "Yes," Miss Marple said with a thin smile. "But it isn't." In the churchyard, near the fountain that hadn't worked since 1967, Edith Wells was telling anyone who'd listened that she'd always suspected something odd about the Redferns. "He never held her hand, not even at the Christmas play," she declared. "Cold fish, that man." "Perhaps," muttered Dr. Graham, who had overheard as he walked by. "But one does not die from poor marital affection." Edith ignored him. "And what about that niece of hers, Caroline? Always flitting about, always wearing those silk scarves and far too much rouge for a girl her age." "She's 27, said Mrs. Finch dryly. "Exactly," Edith said, as though that proved her point. The theories multiplied like rabbits. Some said poison, others divine retribution. A particularly imaginative youth suggested she'd been hexed by a cursed marmalade jar, and his mother promptly banned him from listening to wireless crime serials for a month. The only person who said very little was Mr. Redfern. He had remained largely out of sight since the fete, though not so absent as to avoid comment. Mrs. Templeton claimed she saw him smoking in the garden at midnight. Reverend Longhurst said he'd caught him in the vestry, staring blankly at a hymnal. Neither story was verified, but both were repeated. Inside the Redfern home, the windows stayed shuttered. But that did not stop the villagers from imagining what went on inside, what letters were being read, what sobs might echo through the hallway, what truths were unraveling behind that neat brick facade. Miss Marple visited the greengrocer, the post office, and even stopped to examine the bulletin board near the village hall. She did not need apples, nor stamps, nor information about local yoga classes, but people spoke more freely when one was not asking questions, and so she heard. Mrs. Redfern's sponge cake had been delicious. Several had remarked on it with surprise, surprise being the operative word, as most had expected her usual dense, over-leavened version that required generous tea to wash down. "I thought she must have gotten the recipe from someone else," said Mrs. Larkin at the draper's, folding linen with ferocious precision. "It was light as a cloud, and she gave the first piece to her husband. That's how confident she was." "Confident," echoed Miss Marple softly, turning over a skein of thread as if it might reveal something more. "And she was going to share the marmalade recipe too," Mrs. Larkin added. "Had it written out and everything, or so she said. But no one had seen that recipe. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, such things were rarely missed. I expect it was just talk someone offered, to make herself seem generous. Or, said another, perhaps someone didn't want it shared. It was an innocent comment, spoken with the casual malice of small villages, but to Miss Marple it rang differently. That afternoon, as rain threatened the hedgerows and the sky turned pewter grey, Miss Marple sat once more in her garden. The paper was folded in her lap, the crossword unfinished. She thought not of poison nor heart failure, but of small things, of recipes promised and never seen, of sponge cakes that tasted unlike their maker, of silences and glances and a man who ordered steak the next day. Some mysteries were loud: gunshots, smashed glass, bodies in locked rooms. Others were quieter, like a recipe that never appeared, a dish that vanished, a woman who died just after tasting something no one had tasted before. Miss Marple folded her hands gently over the paper and looked toward the clouds. The village was buzzing, yes, but the truth, as always, would not come from noise. It would come, she knew, from something small, something someone overlooked. Chapter 3. The First Clue and a Red Herring. 2 days after the fete, the village resumed its ordinary rhythm, or tried to. Milk was delivered. Gardeners clipped hedges. The bakery sold its Friday morning batch of Eccles cakes. Yet everything felt just slightly askew, like a crooked painting no one dared to straighten. At the parish council meeting, they spoke of bunting repairs and repainting the cricket pavilion, but the murmured subtext under each agenda item was clear. Someone among them had died, and perhaps not as nature intended. Miss Marple, who had long mastered the art of appearing inattentive, was present but silent. Her knitting needles moved steadily in her lap, creating a neat cuff of grey wool. But behind her pale blue eyes, wheels turned. Earlier that morning she had taken a quiet walk past the red fern home. The rose bushes were trimmed, the curtains pulled back at last. A few visitors had come and gone, mostly neighbors bringing sympathy and casserole. But one visitor in particular had given her pause. It was Caroline Redfern, the niece. Young, poised, and not quite as grieving as one might expect, Caroline had exited the house with her usual silk scarf knotted at her throat and a small leather notebook pressed tightly in her hand. She'd glanced around, not in fear, but in calculation. Then she disappeared down the lane toward the station. A small detail. But small details, Miss Marple knew, were the only ones that ever truly mattered. She had just begun to turn, back when she noticed something else. Something quite unexpected. A glass jar resting on the edge of the red fern garden wall. Not tucked away, not hidden, simply left. Its label had been carefully peeled off, its lid screwed tightly. And inside, clinging to the sides like a memory, was the faintest trace of orange marmalade. Miss Marple stood a long moment, her hand resting on the gatepost. Then she walked on, as though nothing had caught her attention at all. Later that afternoon, Constable Brent made an official visit to Miss Marple's cottage. It wasn't unusual. He often came to check in on her since her fall the previous winter, and he frequently took her advice on which cat belonged to which household. But this visit was a shade more formal. "You heard about the red fern post-mortem?" he asked, seated across from her with a cup of tea he hadn't yet touched. "I've heard it's inconclusive," Miss Marple replied mildly. Brent shifted. "Yes, well, the coroner hasn't ruled it natural causes, not poison either, but there's concern now, and there's pressure from the chief inspector." Miss Marple waited. "The villagers are all over the place with their stories. We're looking into anyone who might have tampered with the food, or had a reason to want Mrs. Redfern gone." "And have you settled on someone?" she asked gently, pouring a fresh cup. Brent cleared his throat. "Possibly. We're looking closely at a Mr. Lionel Craig." Miss Marple blinked. "The piano tuner?" "The same. He was seen near the church hall early before the fete began. Claims he was delivering leaflets, but he had a run-in with Mrs. Redfern last year. Barn apparently accused her of cheating his mother out of a prize for the rhubarb jam." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "I remember. There was quite a dramatic letter in the parish newsletter." Brent leaned in. "And he's known to be unstable, moody sort. Bit too invested in village contests, if you ask me, and he admitted to eating a slice of the sponge cake after Mrs. Redfern had collapsed. Did he appear unwell? She asked. No, but he also mentioned she had a row with her niece that morning. Though Caroline denies it, Miss Marple's eyes twitched ever so slightly. Do you think he did it? Brent asked, watching her carefully. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I think Mr. Craig has very strong feelings about jam competitions, yes. But poisoners, she said, stirring, are rarely emotional. They're precise, cold, and careful. They don't throw fits in newsletters. Brent frowned. So you don't think it's him? I think he's exactly the kind of person people like to suspect, Miss Marple said, which makes him rather convenient. Brent sighed. Convenient or not, he's all we've got for now. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Templeton at the post office. It was under the pretense of purchasing a new notepad, but her true interest was in a question she'd long ago learned how to ask without asking. Oh dear, she said, gazing at the rack of birthday cards. I meant to write to my cousin Adelaide, but I've lost track of her address in Shropshire. Mrs. Templeton, flattered as always to be consulted, offered to check. Redfern's niece was in this morning, you know, she said over her shoulder. Posted a parcel, not local, somewhere in Bristol, I think. Did she? Miss Marple's voice was light. Oddly shaped box, too, and she paid in cash. Miss Marple smiled. As one does when posting gifts, Mrs. Templeton gave a small sniff. Funny time to be mailing things with her aunt not cold in the grave. Miss Marple thanked her for the pad, paid in coins and left. Outside the sun was dipping low, washing the village in long shadows. From the church tower came the toll of the hour. Slow, resonant, final. Miss Marple walked home in silence, her thoughts circling, not Mr. Craig, whose ill temper made him too obvious, but a jar without a label. A sponge cake, too good to be her own. A niece, too calm for comfort. And a marmalade recipe still nowhere to be found. There was a time when the villagers of St. Mary Mead might have settled on the idea that death had come by chance. A poor heart, a bad fall, a cruel twist of fate. But this was not that time. And Miss Marple, well, she had just begun to see the outline of something beneath the surface. A pattern, a shadow, a small inconsistency that didn't quite belong. And to Miss Marple, such things were never accidents. Chapter 4. Miss Marple watches. The pattern emerges. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to accuse, only to compare, and, as she moved through the quiet lanes and hedged gardens of St. Mary Mead that week, she was not seeking scandal. She was seeking familiarity. For evil, she had once remarked to the vicar's wife, rarely arrives with a trumpet. It walks in quietly and borrows the sugar. The Redfern house was not shuttered anymore. It bustled with comings and goings. Mostly mourners, though not without whispers of purpose. The vicar had paid his respects. So had Mrs. Larkin, bearing a gooseberry tart. Caroline Redfern remained a consistent fixture, but oddly silent, not performative as many in grief tend to be, nor inconsolable, simply poised, always with a scarf, always with the same composed smile that revealed nothing. Miss Marple noted it as one might note a swan gliding across a lake, too smooth to trust the stillness beneath. She passed Caroline on the high street one morning and was offered a warm smile. Such a tragedy, isn't it? The girl said softly. We're all still in shock. And yet, Miss Marple replied with her customary sweetness, you seem to be holding up remarkably well, my dear. A flicker, not annoyance but recognition, passed across Caroline's eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. I tried to focus on arrangements. There's a great deal to sort. My aunt was very particular. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. I remember. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat on her garden bench with her needles and a tray of seed packets she had no intention of planting. She was waiting, not for someone, but for something. The village, like most living organisms, operated in predictable cycles. Gossip always ran out of steam just before a new revelation emerged. And sure enough, by 3 o'clock, Mrs. Finch came bustling up the path. You'll never believe it, Jane. The Redfern solicitor came by the cottage today. Not to me, to Mr. Redfern, of course, but I saw them talking through the study window. Grim faces. Mr. Redfern was shaking his head like he'd just been told he'd inherited a curse. Perhaps he has, Miss Marple said gently. Money tends to bring out unusual reactions in people. Well, according to Mrs. Davenport, who was invited in for tea afterwards, there's no will, or rather, the one they found is terribly old, from before Caroline came to live with them. No mention of her then? Apparently not. And she's livid, Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Did she say so? No, but she took the car keys and drove off without saying a word. In tears, Mrs. Davenport said, sped off toward Much Benham like the devil was chasing her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People rarely run from grief, dear, but they do run from consequences. Mrs. Finch blinked. I don't think anything, Miss Marple replied. I'm merely observing, always safest, to supper that evening. Miss Marple ate alone, as she had done for many years, and listened to the wireless murmuring softly in the corner. It was a comfort, not a distraction. Her thoughts remained with the Redferns, or rather with the absence of a recipe, for that was the strange thing, and no one could produce it, not even Mr. Redfern. Caroline, when asked, had said only that her aunt must have misplaced it. Yet it was something Mrs. Redfern had promised to display. She had said so to multiple people who expected to see it pinned near her sponge. Cake at the fete. And then there was the cake itself. Miss Marple had only taken a small bite, but it had been striking. Light, citrusy, and almost unfamiliar in its excellence. Not her usual, not even close. Miss Marple found herself thinking of another case. Years ago, in a village called East Brindley, a woman had claimed to be making strawberry preserves using her grandmother's method, but the jars had a faint taste of lemon, balm, something quite fashionable and quite not her grandmother's taste. It had turned out the jars weren't hers at all. She'd lifted them from her neighbor in a bid to win a blue ribbon. People steal strange things, Miss Marple thought. Jewels, yes, but also glory, or legacy. Could someone have stolen the recipe? Or the cake? Or worse, used the cake as a means to an end? The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard with a bunch of forget-me-nots. There was no headstone for Mrs. Redfern yet, but a temporary marker had been placed beneath the lilac tree. Miss Marple knelt to place the flowers. I wonder, she said quietly, what you were about to reveal. The sound of a throat clearing behind her made her turn. It was Mr. Redfern. He looked tired, drawn. His collar slightly askew, and eyes, red from either tears or sleeplessness. Perhaps both. Miss Marple, he said with a faint nod, didn't expect to see anyone here. I find flowers help settle the mind, she replied, standing slowly. Even when they do little for the soil. He gave a dry chuckle. Yes, that sounds like something Hilda would have said. There was a moment of silence between them. Then Miss Marple spoke again. She'd promised a recipe, you know. The marmalade. He looked startled. She did. She told several people so, but no one's seen it. Mr. Redfern frowned. I didn't even know she was planning to share it. She guarded that thing like a family heirloom. Miss Marple looked gently at him. And what about the cake? His brow furrowed. The sponge. Yes, it was very good, unusually so. Very good. He looked down at the grass. She was working on something new. Said she wanted to impress people. I never saw her baking it, though. She did it early while I was out walking. Ah, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. She left him standing there and walked slowly back to her cottage. She was beginning to see it now. Not clearly, not entirely, but faintly. The outline of a pattern. A cake that wasn't hers. A recipe that vanished, and a niece who never looked surprised. Miss Marple settled into her armchair and pulled the knitting close again. Everyone else saw random threads. She was starting to see the weave. Chapter 5 for Wrong Suspect. A false lead. The accusation, when it came, arrived not with handcuffs or sirens, but with the quiet rustle of a letter slit beneath a door. By the next morning, everyone knew Lionel Craig, the piano tuner with an unfortunate temper and a history of petty grievances, had been asked to assist the authorities further regarding the death of Mrs. Redfern. He had not been arrested, merely questioned, at length in much Benham, but in the court of village opinion, the verdict was nearly unanimous. Well, he always was odd, Mrs. Templeton told Miss Marple in the post office, her voice lowered as she passed over a packet of stamps. Staring, eyes, talks to himself, hasn't been right since his mother died. He also has a very sensitive ear, Miss Marple replied mildly. Once heard a loose tuning pin before the pianist even sat down. Mrs. Templeton sniffed, all the more reason to believe he noticed something no one else did. That, or he's simply more observant than most. Which can be dangerous, Mrs. Templeton said, tapping the counter for emphasis. People don't like being watched. Miss Marple agreed, though not aloud. In the next days, the village moved as it always did when a target was named, toward comfort. Accusation creates a kind of relief, especially when the accused fits a particular mold. Lionel Craig was unmarried, reclusive, and had once caused a minor scene at the harvest supper by declaring the custard inauthentic. That was enough for most. He's a jealous man, murmured Edith Wells over tea at the vicarage. And Mrs. Redfern beat his mother, 2 years running at the jam table. I heard he threatened to poison her cat, offered Mrs. Larkin. That cat died, you know, said Nora Prentice solemnly. In '87, very sudden. And now, Mrs. Redfern, Edith said, eyes wide. You see the pattern, but... Miss Marple saw another kind of pattern entirely. One stitched together not by malice, but by convenience, for Lionel Craig was too easy. He had no access to the Redfern home, no history with Caroline, and no clear reason to be at the fete, early enough to tamper with the food. The supposed argument overheard near the rectory now appeared more and more like a mistaken identity. Several villagers recalled seeing Mr. Redfern speaking animatedly with his wife that same morning, which could easily have been confused in the haze of gossip. And then there was the sponge cake. Miss Marple remembered something odd in Mr. Redfern's manner when she'd asked about it. He had seemed genuinely confused, not in the defensive way of someone hiding guilt, but in the helpless way of someone realizing they had not, in fact, known the person closest to them. Could Lionel Craig have poisoned a cake he didn't bake, or stolen a recipe he never tasted? It was possible, but it didn't feel likely. Miss Marple did what she always did when something troubled her. She made a visit to the library. She wasn't looking for fiction. Not today. Instead, she perused the cookery section, specifically a worn volume titled English Preserves and Confections Through the Ages. Page after page detailed the intricacies of boiling, zesting, sugaring, and setting. She made notes cross-referencing the types of marmalade associated with different regions: Seville, Oxford, bitter orange, and so forth. What she found was curious. One particular recipe, tucked in a footnote, mentioned a rare variation of marmalade, one infused with a dash of saffron and a hint of almond extract. It was considered unique, even slightly exotic, and was popularized in a handful of London tea rooms during the 1920s. Miss Marple had tasted something like it once, decades ago, at a small hotel in Bayswater. She remembered because it was so unusual, floral, almost perfumed. A marmalade that lingered, and that same whisper of scent had lingered, just faintly, in the jar on the red fern wall. It was not the marmalade of a woman clinging to tradition. It was the marmalade of someone trying to impress or deceive. That evening she returned home to find a letter on her doormat, handwritten in a familiar curling script. Dear Miss Marple, I believe you asked about the cake. I'd be happy to speak with you if you're still curious. Sincerely, Caroline. The note was polite, even warm, but something about it felt rehearsed. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived at the Redfern home at precisely 11, her gloves buttoned and her handbag neatly clasped. Caroline received her in the sitting room. She was wearing green, the shade too bright for morning, Miss Marple thought, and her usual silk scarf, twisted once and knotted at the nape. I imagine you've had rather a time of it, Miss Marple said kindly. Caroline smiled, folding her hands in her lap. Yes, it's all been quite confusing, especially the police interest in Mr. Craig. You don't think it was him? I think, Caroline said with careful neutrality, that he had every reason to dislike my aunt. But that's not the same thing, is it? No, Miss Marple agreed. It rarely is. There was a brief pause. I do hope they find the recipe, Caroline added, almost offhandedly. Oh, you're still looking for it? Caroline hesitated. Well, yes, I thought she might have left a copy somewhere. She was very proud of it. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet you told Mrs. Templeton she never wrote things down. The pause this time was longer. I may have misremembered. Perfectly understandable, Miss Marple said lightly. Memory is a fragile thing. She let the silence stretch. Caroline reached for the teapot. More tea, please. As she poured, Miss Marple's eyes fell on the small, open notebook on the side table. Leather-bound, faintly stained. The same one she'd seen in Caroline's hand as she left the house days earlier. It was turned to a page titled Citrus Infusion, Marmalade Notes. Miss Marple said nothing, but in her mind, something clicked into place. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a seed. Outside, the first rain in weeks began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Caroline stirred sugar into her cup and smiled faintly. You don't really think Lionel Craig did it, do you? Miss Marple smiled back, eyes twinkling. Oh no, my dear, she said quietly. But I do think someone wants us to. Chapter 6. A hidden clue, dismissed by all. The rain lingered for 2 more days, as if the village itself were hesitant to move forward. It dripped from the eaves of the cottages, soaked the cricket field into uselessness, and turned the churchyard paths into slick ribbons of mud. The fate was already a fading memory, but Mrs. Redfern's death clung to St. Mary Mead like mist on hedgerows, not heavy enough to stop life, but persistent enough to sour it. Miss Marple, however, never minded the rain. It kept people indoors and talking. There's a particular honesty that arrives when conversation must happen over garden fences or through steamed shop windows. People feel safer saying things when they believe no one truly hears. It was in the grocer's, a quiet, late afternoon stop for eggs and peppermints, that Miss Marple overheard something curious. "She was forgetful at the end," said Mrs. Larkin, shaking out her umbrella near the potato bin. "Mrs. Redfern, I mean, kept writing things down and then losing the paper." "Oh, yes," chimed in the grocer's wife. "She came in twice last week for marmalade oranges, paid cash both times, forgot the first batch entirely, said she'd misplaced the whole bag." Miss Marple, selecting a tin of treacle from the shelf, kept her expression pleasant. "That is strange," she said lightly. "I've always thought her rather precise." "Well," Mrs. Larkin shrugged, "we all get scatterbrained, don't we? My Albert once put salt in his tea, swore he was dying." They laughed, and the moment passed. But Miss Marple held on to it. Mrs. Redfern had forgotten the bag of oranges, then repurchased the same thing as though unaware. And yet the cake she brought to the fete had been flawless, the work of someone in full control of her faculties, light, balanced, daring even with its subtle citrus and hint of floral depth. It didn't add up. People who forget groceries do not create culinary masterpieces on a whim, unless the cake wasn't hers. That evening, Miss Marple stood at her writing desk turning over a letter she had received from her cousin Adelaide in Shropshire. It was unrelated, a note about a new gardener and a dreadful incident involving a misplaced privet. But her mind was elsewhere. She stared at the recipe book she'd retrieved from the library again, rereading the saffron almond variation with a quiet intensity. Such a combination wasn't common in rural homes. Too continental, too costly. And yet the taste had been there, unmistakably. Someone had used that recipe. But who? And more importantly, why? It was then that she remembered something else. During her brief visit to the Redfern home, Caroline had offered tea and sponge fingers set out neatly on a china tray. But there had been no marmalade in the kitchen, none visible on the pantry shelves, no jars stacked or labeled or even tucked away. Curious for a woman who had made it her signature and had supposedly made a fresh batch before the fete. Had they all been eaten, given away, or had they never existed at all? The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, umbrella in hand, boots crunching over the wet gravel path. She had asked the vicar's wife for a small favor, access to the leftover fete items stored in the church hall cupboard. "I do hope you're not planning another stall already, Jane," said Mrs. Longhurst cheerfully. "My bunting's still in mourning." "Nothing so ambitious," Miss Marple assured her, "just tying up loose ends." The cupboard was dusty and dim, a slightly damp collection of folding chairs, faded banners, and half-used poster boards from years of village events. But Miss Marple moved with purpose. On the bottom shelf, half-tucked beneath a box of paper lanterns, she found it. A dish, white ceramic, oval, with faint, fluted edging and a chip along the underside. She turned it slowly, a smudge of cake still, clung to one corner, hardened now but not forgotten. It was the same dish she'd seen Mrs. Redfern guarding early the morning of the fete, the one she had later presented the sponge on, the one that had disappeared by the time the body was removed. Miss Marple wrapped it in a clean handkerchief and tucked it gently into her bag. Back at home, she examined it under the window light. There, beneath the edge of the dish, was a faint fingerprint, not clear enough for police perhaps, but suggestive. Smudged with something waxy. Lipstick? No, Miss Marple lifted it closer and sniffed, not lipstick. Almond and something else. A faint chemical tang, almost medicinal. She sat very still for several moments, her fingers pressed together in thought. Most villagers would have dismissed the dish. It was just a plate, an object among many. But Miss Marple saw what it meant. It was hidden when it should have been cleaned and returned. It was placed not in a bin or a washpan, but behind decorations no one would search for weeks. Someone had tried to forget this dish, which meant, of course, that it mattered, and someone had noticed her noticing. That evening, as Miss Marple took her usual twilight walk down the lane, a habit she maintained for both health and observation, she had the uncanny sense of being watched, not overtly, just subtly, the way curtains twitch in perfect rhythm with footsteps, the way a car engine starts without going anywhere. It wasn't fear she felt. It was recognition. Someone now knew that she was paying attention, and that, more than cake or marmalade, made her dangerous. Miss Marple returned home, placed the dish in a lined drawer, and locked it away. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to someone who might not yet know she suspected them. But tonight she would sleep, for clarity never comes when you chase it. You must invite it in like a cat and let it settle in its own time. She turned off the lamp. Outside the rain had stopped, but something else had begun. Chapter 7. Secrets and tensions spill out by the end of the week. The polite fabric of St. Mary Mead began to fray. It was visible not in raised voices. Villagers didn't shout, they whispered sharply, but in the stiffness of conversations, the way once friendly nods turned into brisk acknowledgments, and how doors now closed just a little too quickly after visitors left. The death of Mrs. Redfern had not only unsettled the village, it had unbalanced it. With Lionel Craig conveniently cast as the likely culprit, others felt emboldened to speak truths they'd previously tucked beneath polite smiles. "I suppose it had to happen sometime," murmured Edith Wells to Miss Marple one afternoon outside the bakery. She was not an easy woman, Hilda Redfern, terribly fond of control and secrets. Miss Marple gave a mild hum of interest. "Secrets, dear?" "Oh, yes. She and her husband barely spoke the last few months. Everyone knows it. He took to walking alone by the meadow used to be. They always went together." Miss Marple recalled those very walks, noticing recently how Mr. Redfern had lingered longer, returned later, and often looked not refreshed, but burdened. They were growing apart. "More like he was growing tired," Edith replied. "And Caroline? Well, she's not quite the grieving niece, is she?" It was a curious thing. Caroline, who had for years remained mostly in the background, now moved through the village with a certain confidence. Her presence had become deliberate, a woman not hiding, but gently commanding the room. She visited the shops daily, spoke with practiced graciousness, and wore, always, that same signature silk scarf. She always seemed ambitious, Edith added in a low voice, too polished, as if village life were beneath her. "She had plans to leave, I believe," Miss Marple said, "before her aunt's death." "Exactly. She was applying for some kind of culinary course in Bath, wanted to start her own cafe." "How enterprising," Miss Marple replied, "and rather unexpected. But it explained things, didn't it? The exquisite cake, the saffron-laced marmalade, the missing recipe. Perhaps it hadn't gone missing at all. Perhaps it had never been Hilda Redfern's to begin with. That evening, as dusk poured through the kitchen windows, Miss Marple brewed a second pot of tea and reread a short note from her cousin, in Much Benham, a retired librarian who had, at Miss Marple's quiet request, made a few inquiries into Caroline's background. Caroline, it seemed, had been employed briefly at a hotel just outside Bath, in the kitchens of all places. A junior role, a few months only, but long enough to learn things, to observe, perhaps even to borrow a few recipes from a chef who wouldn't miss them. That aligned well with what Miss Marple already suspected. The famous sponge cake wasn't invented in St. Mary Mead. It had been imported, made to look homespun, but layered with borrowed brilliance. The next morning brought another ripple through the village. This time from the vicar's wife, who reported that Mrs. Redfern's solicitor had finally received word of an updated will. Apparently, she had revised it, Mrs. Longhurst told Miss Marple over morning tea, just never filed it formally, left it in her sewing drawer of all places. Did it change things? Mrs. Longhurst lowered her voice. Quite. Caroline was named sole beneficiary, everything, the house, the savings, even the stocks. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured, and what's more, the document was dated 3 weeks before the fete. Before the promise to share the marmalade recipe, then? Yes. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled gently. No reason at all. The timing was important. A new will, a recipe promised for the first time, a cake too fine for the baker, and a sudden death at a public event, witnessed by dozens, ensuring that suspicion would be deflected by chaos. At the grocer's later that afternoon, tension broke the surface. Mrs. Finch and Caroline crossed paths near the preserves shelf, and what began as a civil exchange turned swiftly sharp. I heard your aunt left you everything, Mrs. Finch said without preamble, her tone tight. Quite the surprise, considering how little she spoke of you. Caroline's lips curved into a practiced smile. Families are complicated, Mrs. Finch. I don't expect you'd understand. Is that so? My aunt and I were very close, in our way. Close enough to know where she kept her recipes, I suppose. Caroline's eyes flickered. What are you implying? Oh, I'm not implying anything, said Mrs. Finch, voice sweet as poisoned honey. Just wondering how a niece so full of grief has so much time to visit every shop in the village. Caroline turned sharply and left without replying, her footsteps quick across the floorboards. Miss Marple, in the queue behind them, said nothing. But her mind was now whirring. People were beginning to talk, and not just about the murder. They were beginning to untangle the relationships that had quietly twisted beneath the surface for years. Later that day, she stopped at the church hall to return a borrowed book, and found Mr. Redfern standing by the notice board, staring at a flyer for a charity recital. You've had a hard few weeks, she said gently. He nodded. Harder than I imagined. Grief is strange. Sometimes it comes as anger. Anger at whom? At her. At me, at myself, for not knowing more. Miss Marple waited. She was planning something, he said, voice low. I found a note, scribbled and half-torn, said something about making things right before the fete. I thought maybe she meant Caroline, or maybe something else. Did she say what exactly? No, just that she had one more thing to do. It was in her sewing drawer. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. Alongside the new will? Yes, I didn't think anything of it at the time, but Miss Marple did. One more thing to do, a final decision, a truth perhaps about who created what, and who would benefit. Whatever Mrs. Redfern had planned, she had not lived to complete it. But someone else had. Miss Marple thanked him and walked slowly home, the first hints of chill entering the evening air. The village was fraying, yes, but only because something was tugging at the wrong threads, and Miss Marple, careful, methodical, was beginning to see who held the end of the string. Chapter 8. A second incident, a warning or mistake. The second incident, when it occurred, was not nearly as dramatic as the first. There was no crowd, no public scene, no body, collapsing into sponge cake. But for Miss Marple, it was far more telling. It happened on a Thursday morning during her usual walk past the greengrocer and onto the narrow lane behind the rectory. The air was crisp, the sky untroubled, and the village, outwardly, calm. She was halfway down the lane when she noticed something odd. The garden gate of the Redfern house stood ajar, not wide enough to suggest intrusion, but just enough to seem uncharacteristic. Mrs. Redfern had always insisted on keeping it latched, a habit her husband and niece had apparently maintained since her death. Miss Marple hesitated for only a second before continuing her walk. It wasn't until later, when she returned via the same path, that she saw the broken teacup. It lay in fragments just beyond the gate, half hidden beneath a rosebush. Blue-rimmed porcelain, the same pattern as the china Caroline had served her tea on just a few days before. But the odd thing wasn't that it was broken. It was that it had been placed, not dropped. The largest shard sat upright, as though someone had set it there and then scattered the rest to make it appear accidental. Miss Marple crouched carefully and gathered the pieces, wrapping them in the handkerchief she always kept tucked into her sleeve. As she stood again, she had the distinct feeling of being observed, not overtly, just a twinge, the way the air feels when someone is watching through a window without moving. She turned slowly. No one was there. Back home, she examined the shards under lamplight. There, on the underside of the largest piece, was a single word in ink. Faded, blurred by weather or water. Ridgewood. She sat very still for a long time. Ridgewood was not a word one stumbled upon. It was the name of the hotel in Bath, where Caroline had worked briefly last year. The very place her cousin in Much Benham had mentioned. Why would that word be written beneath a teacup? More importantly, who had placed it there? And why? She considered two possibilities. Either someone had tried to warn her, or someone was sending a message to back away. She suspected the latter. That evening a knock came at her door just after supper. It was Constable Brent, hat in hand, raincoat damp from an earlier drizzle. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside at her gesture. "There's been another small matter." "Oh?" "At the Redfern house," he said. "Broken window." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Burglary? No sign of forced entry. And nothing appears to have been stolen. But Mr. Redfern's shaken. Says someone's been in the pantry. A jar's gone." "A jar?" Brent nodded. "Marmalade, one of the last batches his wife made, apparently." Miss Marple's throat tightened, not with surprise but with confirmation. "And when was it taken?" "Hard to say. He didn't notice until this morning. Caroline says she hadn't been in the pantry in days." "How convenient," Miss Marple murmured. Brent sighed. "We're keeping it quiet. No need to alarm the village. But perhaps we should." she said quietly. Someone is trying very hard to rewrite the past, piece by piece. Brent looked at her for a long moment. You've got something, haven't you? I've got the edges of something, she replied. But I need the center before it will make sense. That night, sleep was slow to come. Miss Marple lay awake, thinking of the dish hidden in her drawer, the note from Caroline, the absent recipe. And now, a single word beneath a shattered teacup. Ridgewood. She rose just after dawn and wrote a letter to her cousin Adelaide, asking for a favor to contact the Ridgewood Hotel in Bath and inquire discreetly whether any of their chefs from the previous year had recently moved or left a position suddenly. If someone had stolen a recipe, perhaps someone else had noticed. By midday, another hush fell over the village, a quiet different from morning. Rumors had begun again. Mrs. Templeton claimed she'd seen Caroline burning papers in the garden the previous night. Though through drawn curtains, it must be said, Mrs. Finch said she had not seen Caroline at all since the broken window. And Mr. Penhaligon, who rarely noticed anything but the price of sausages, remarked that someone had purchased almond essence and lemon peel from the grocer the day before. Ingredients neither common nor seasonal, the timing was too precise to ignore. Miss Marple visited the post office to mail her letter and found herself stopped outside by the vicar, Reverend Longhurst. "Jane," he said softly, "do you think there's truly something more here?" She met his eyes and gave a small, weary smile. "When the ground is soft," she said, "one needn't see footprints to know someone's passed through." He nodded gravely. And that, she thought, was exactly it. There were signs, not obvious ones, but quiet disruptions. A missing jar, a strange word, a dish discarded, a recipe vanished, and now another incident. Too subtle to shout, but too strange to ignore. Someone had grown desperate, and desperation, Miss Marple knew, made people sloppy. She tucked her gloves into her bag and turned down the lane toward the Redfern house. It was time to ask one more question, not to accuse, just to listen. Chapter 9. Miss Marple sets her trap. Miss Marple had never believed in cornering suspects. That was a tactic for men with badges and shouting voices, the kind who slammed fists on desks and demanded confessions in dimly lit rooms. Her approach was more delicate, like pruning roses, a snip here, a soft touch there, until the hidden form beneath the thorns revealed itself. So it was with quiet resolve that she found herself once again at the Redfern house, politely greeted by Caroline, whose smile faltered ever so slightly when she opened the door. "A surprise," Caroline said, stepping aside, "though I imagine you've come about the burglary." "In part," Miss Marple said, "but mostly I've come for a recipe." Caroline blinked. "A recipe?" "Yes. You see, I've had the most dreadful time replicating your aunt's sponge. I wondered if you happened to know the measurements. She never used scales, of course, and I suspect there was something citrusy about it. Orange flower water, perhaps." Caroline hesitated. "Oh, I'm not sure I could help. She didn't share her baking secrets with anyone." "That's what I thought," Miss Marple said pleasantly, following her into the sitting room. "But then I remembered. You baked, didn't you? You worked in a hotel kitchen in Bath." Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice stayed light. "Very briefly, I was only ever on prep duty." "Still, it must have taught you a great deal." "I suppose it did." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands in her lap. "Did your aunt know about your time there?" "She did." The answer was quick, too quick. I wonder then whether she might have used one of your recipes, this sponge, for example. It wasn't quite her style, lighter, more refined, almost professional. Caroline's expression flickered. Are you saying she didn't make it? Oh, not at all. Only that it reminded me of something I tasted once, many years ago. In Bayswater, I believe. A hotel served it with a thin glaze of saffron marmalade. Most unusual, and oddly similar to the one your aunt brought to the fete. There was a silence, just long enough. Caroline rose suddenly. Tea? Only if it's no trouble. In the kitchen, the sounds of kettle, cups and cupboard doors masked whatever expression Caroline might have worn. Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes wandering to the bookshelf where the same leather-bound notebook rested, now closed, now moved slightly from where it had been during her last visit. When Caroline returned with tea, her smile had reappeared, carefully reconstructed. I'm afraid I'm not much of a baker these days, she said as she poured. My aunt discouraged it, said I'd only make a mess of her kitchen. Did she? Miss Marple sipped. That seems unlike her. She was always so proud of appearances. She could be possessive, Caroline said, voice low. Even cruel. She didn't like to be challenged. No, I imagine she didn't. Pause. Caroline shifted in her seat. Is there something you're not asking me, Miss Marple? The question was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. Miss Marple smiled softly. There's always something I'm not asking, my dear. It's how I make room for what people choose to say. Caroline gave a short laugh, sharp and humorless. Then allow me to save us both time. I did not poison my aunt. I did not tamper with her sponge, and I certainly didn't steal a marmalade recipe. Miss Marple regarded her for a moment. No one's accused you, Caroline. But now that you've said it, perhaps you'd tell me why you posted a parcel to Ridgewood Hotel the day after your aunt's death. Caroline froze. It was subtle, a twitch of the hand holding her teacup, the slightest tightening around her mouth. But Miss Marple saw it. I believe the postmistress recalls it. An oddly shaped parcel, paid in cash, sent to a former chef there, perhaps, someone who might have recognized his own recipe when he read about the fate in the local papers. Caroline set her cup down harder than necessary. What do you want, Miss Marple? To understand. I didn't hurt her, Caroline said firmly. Yes, I made the sponge. Yes, it was my recipe. I needed people to taste it, to prove it was good enough, that I was good enough. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the marmalade? Caroline looked away. Also mine, but my aunt didn't know. I let her believe I was helping her, not leading. And when she decided to share the recipe, it felt like a theft. Caroline flinched. She didn't ask. She knew I was planning to submit it. She knew I wanted to leave, but she wanted credit. She always wanted credit. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. She planned to share it publicly. She said, finally, pin it beside the cake. That's what she told people. She didn't deserve to. She never made a single jar. But she did make a will. Caroline's eyes snapped back. What? A revised one, leaving everything to you, dated 3 weeks before the fete. Found in her sewing drawer. Caroline looked genuinely stunned. I didn't know, she whispered. Miss Marple rose gently. And perhaps that's the tragedy, Caroline. She was cruel, yes. But perhaps she also recognized your talent. Perhaps she wanted to make peace, in her own way. But you've told me you didn't hurt her, Miss Marple said, gathering her bag. And I believe you, but someone else might not. What do you mean? Miss Marple paused in the doorway. Your aunt didn't die of a heart condition. nor of poison in the usual sense, but I suspect someone tried to frighten her. Just enough. And perhaps she overreacted. Perhaps she panicked. And panic, in a woman her age, can be fatal. Caroline's face had gone pale. "I didn't mean to," she began, but stopped herself. Miss Marple simply smiled. A kind, sad smile. "No need to say what you didn't mean, but if you're hiding something, Caroline, now might be the time to set it down." Then she turned and stepped into the soft grey afternoon, where the village waited with its usual hush and eyes behind curtains. The trap had been set, not with bait, but with silence, and someone, soon, would step into it. Chapter 10. The final detail falls into place. The air inns, St. Mary Mead had shifted again. Subtly, like the first breath of autumn curling beneath a summer breeze. It was something in the way people paused before speaking now, the way they glanced toward the red fern house and then away again, quickly, as though to look too long might invite trouble. Miss Marple moved through the village as she always did, quietly, purposefully, without fuss. But beneath her calm exterior, the pieces were beginning to settle, like tea leaves collecting in the bottom of a cup, forming a pattern that was no longer so difficult to read. It came, as it often did, not with a dramatic clue or sudden revelation, but with an offhand remark, this time from Nora Prentice. They were seated together outside the haberdasher's, waiting for the delivery cart to clear the narrow lane. "She always carried that notebook," Nora said, without context. "Your friend Hilda Redfern." "Her recipe notebook, you mean?" "Yes. Wouldn't go anywhere without it. Said she didn't trust her memory anymore, and I believed her. Saw her write in it just before the fete, actually. Outside the church, hall, she had that sponge with her, all proud of it, and she was scribbling something down like she was making final adjustments." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Adjustments? Yes, you know. Last-minute things, like when you remember the temperature's too high or you want to swap one thing for another." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "What was she writing on?" "Oh, the back of a flyer, I think. She'd tucked it into her notebook afterward." "And what happened to the flyer?" Nora blinked. "How should I know?" But Miss Marple knew. She remembered something. A detail from earlier that had seemed inconsequential at the time. In the church hall cupboard, where she had found the chipped cake dish, there had also been a box of leftover fete materials, old signs, folded bunting, unused paper flyers advertising lemonade and tombola, and guess the jelly bean jar. She had dismissed them then. But now, she realized, if Mrs. Redfern had written on one and tucked it somewhere, and if no one had cleared the box since, Miss Marple rose with a gracious apology and made her way back to the church. The cupboard was dim, the air heavy with disuse, but she moved with purpose. She pulled out the box, fingers careful, deliberate, lifting each flyer one by one. Near the bottom, slightly smudged with ink and lemon curd, she found it, a torn sheet, one corner browned as if brushed against a hot pan on the back, in a tidy, but slightly wavering script. Reduce sugar to 3/4 cup. Add 1-2 tsp almond extract. Check marmalade acidity. Last batch was too sharp. Ask Caroline Re. Saffron. Sure. Miss Marple exhaled, long and low. It wasn't just a recipe note. It was a moment. The moment Mrs. Redfern had acknowledged, perhaps for the first time, that she was not the sole author of her culinary triumph. That she was taking input from Caroline. That something new had been created. Not hers entirely, but shared. That kind of moment could be frightening. To some, freeing. To others, threatening. She placed the flyer gently into her handbag and walked home, her pace steady. That evening, she sat in her front room, windows open to the cool air, knitting, idle in her lap. The dish was still locked in the drawer. The fragments of the teacup remained wrapped in cloth. The smell of almond and citrus memory now still clung to her mind. But this note, this small scrap of honesty, was the final detail. The last piece. It told her two things. First, that Mrs. Redfern knew the recipe wasn't entirely hers. Second, that she intended to credit Caroline. Perhaps she would do so subtly, a whispered mention at the fete, or a smile in her niece's direction when the prize was given. But for someone like Caroline, who had spent years watching from the shadows, who had worked quietly and been dismissed, it might have felt like too little, too late. And yet, Caroline hadn't known about the will. She hadn't known she stood to inherit everything. Which changed things. It made the story more tragic, more human. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly to the fire grate, where a thin scattering of ashes had begun to settle from her last fire. She thought of Caroline burning papers, as Mrs. Templeton claimed. What might she have burned? Copies of recipes, notes from Ridgewood, correspondence with a chef who might ask questions, or had she burned something else? Guilt, perhaps. Not over murder, but over a warning gone too far. If Caroline had attempted to frighten her aunt into stepping aside, into silence, and if that warning had resulted in real, irreversible harm, what then? The broken jar of marmalade, the stolen dish, the vanished recipe. Each act was not part of a crime of greed, but of damage control. The desperate unmaking of a narrative that had spiraled beyond what Caroline had intended, and somewhere in the background, a second presence. Quieter, colder. Miss Marple frowned. She rose again and took the dish from her drawer. It was time to speak with Mr. Redfern. Not because she suspected him, not entirely, but because something about his stillness had begun to feel less like grief and more like resignation. She knocked on the Redfern door just as the sun began to set. He answered after a pause, still in shirt sleeves, his collar open, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought we might see you again." "I've come with a question," she said, "and a fragment of truth." He nodded once and stepped aside. Chapter 11. The Gathering. Calm before the truth. The door of the Redfern house closed softly behind Miss Marple as she stepped inside, Mr. Redfern leading her into the sitting room. The air was cool, the shadows long, and the house, despite its recent loss, had the same air of quiet elegance it always had. A place where people waited for things to be said and then never quite found the words. Mr. Redfern gestured for Miss Marple to sit, his expression weary but polite. He had not yet asked her directly what she wanted, but the silence between them felt like an invitation. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "But I do need to ask about something. Something that has been troubling me." He looked at her with curiosity, but no alarm. His manner was still the same calmness that had greeted her the other day, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in his posture. A man who had been waiting for a question he didn't want to answer. "I know this is difficult," she began softly, "but I must ask about your wife's will." His face tightened, briefly, as if a breath had been held too long. "My wife's will," he repeated as though the words had no power to comfort him. "There's nothing unusual about it." She left everything to Caroline, just as we discussed. And the recipe? Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost conversational. The marmalade recipe? He blinked, surprised. What does that have to do with the will? Not much, perhaps, but I've been thinking. Mrs. Redfern planned to share that recipe at the fete, didn't she? Yes, she did, he said. She'd promised. She had no reason not to. She'd mentioned it to several people, including Mrs. Templeton and Miss Prentice. Yet it never appeared. He was silent for a long moment. Miss Marple could see the way his thoughts moved beneath his eyes. Slow, calculating. And in that silence, Miss Marple found the space she needed. It's strange, isn't it? How the one thing she promised to share disappeared. Almost as though it had never existed in the first place. You think she was lying? Mr. Redfern's voice was even, though Miss Marple noticed the way his jaw clenched. I think she had reasons to keep it hidden, Miss Marple said. I think your wife knew more about that recipe than she let on. He glanced away, as if the truth was something he could no longer avoid. You think Caroline had a hand in this? He asked, his voice sharp. But there was a flicker of uncertainty beneath the edge. My niece? Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. Not in the way you think. The room was silent again, except for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. For a long time, neither spoke, both of them mulling over the words that had been said and the ones that had not been spoken. At last, Mr. Redfern exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the past days had finally caught up to him. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her. I don't know what you're implying, he said softly. But I suspect there's more you're not saying. Perhaps you're right. Hilda and I weren't close in the last years. She was obsessed with her own pride, with being right, and Caroline. She never did understand her aunt's view of things. They never saw eye to eye. Perhaps that's why Mrs. Redfern made the changes she did, Miss Marple said. Perhaps she intended to finally give Caroline what she wanted and take something back. Mr. Redfern looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Take something back. The recipe, of course, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but insistent. The one your wife had promised to share, but which she never did. Perhaps she had second thoughts. Perhaps she wanted to hold on to it a little longer, to keep something for herself. Something to pass on only when she was ready. He stared at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head, as though the weight of it all had simply become too much. Caroline's not a killer, he said, his voice thick with disbelief. She's not. No, Miss Marple agreed gently. But desperation can lead people to do things they wouldn't otherwise. There was a long silence before Mr. Redfern spoke again, his voice quieter now. I suppose I'm not the only one who's been afraid. Afraid of what comes next, what we've lost. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers gently pressing together. That's what makes it so dangerous, Mr. Redfern. We all have things we wish we could undo, things we regret. And sometimes when someone else holds the key to that regret, we make the wrong choice. I didn't think she'd really hurt Hilda, he muttered, his eyes unfocused. But Caroline was always so eager to be seen, to be recognized. She never let anyone get in her way. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Do you remember the last time you spoke to your wife, before the fete? His eyes shifted, as though he were trying to recall the moment. It was brief, she seemed distracted, but then she always was at that point. She said she was going to get the marmalade out of the pantry, and I left her to it. Just like that. She was busy, he said again. I didn't think twice. I didn't know she was preparing to reveal everything. She'd told me so little about her plans. And Caroline? She wasn't there at that point, he said, his voice tinged with something else. Something Miss Marple could not quite place. I didn't know where she was that morning. I thought she was out, meeting with people about the cafe. Did she ever talk about the cafe to you? Once or twice, he muttered. But I didn't think she was serious. She never followed through. Miss Marple remained still, watching him, letting the silence take root between them. She felt the answers were here, just out of reach, and all she had to do was wait for the right moment. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the shadows flickering across the walls. And then, slowly, Mr. Redfern looked up, as if a quiet realization had dawned upon him. Miss Marple, he said softly. You don't think it was an accident, do you? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. Accidents are things we can explain away, she replied. But what happened to your wife wasn't an accident. The truth, she knew, was finally within reach. And soon, the village of St. Mary Mead would know it too. Chapter 12. The Reveal. Devastating Simplicity. The village of St. Mary Mead had, for the most part, returned to its familiar rhythm by the following Saturday. The sun shone brighter and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted through the air. Yet beneath the calm surface, the tension still lingered. The quiet hum of something unfinished, still to be resolved. Miss Marple knew that the time had come. The subtle strands of the mystery she had so carefully unraveled would now come together, and the truth would no longer be something whispered behind closed doors. That afternoon, she invited Mr. Redfern to the church hall. He had agreed, somewhat hesitantly, but had promised to meet her there. The hall was empty, save for a few remnants of the recent fête, a faded banner, and some scattered tables pushed against the walls. It had the air of a place waiting for something to happen, as though even the walls knew that something was about to change. Miss Marple sat at a table, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup as she waited. The door opened quietly, and Mr. Redfern stepped in, his face lined with wariness and something else. Something that could not quite be defined. Miss Marple, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of resignation. I've been thinking, Miss. Marple smiled softly. Thinking is a good start, Mr. Redfern. He nodded, stepping further into the room. He still carried the weight of the past days with him, but there was something different now, a clarity that had not been there before. Go on, Miss Marple encouraged, her voice gentle. I've been trying to put everything together, and I think I understand now. I understand what happened. But I need to hear it from you. I need to hear you say it. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She had already made her deductions, but now was the moment to make them known, not with grand gestures or dramatic flair, but with the quiet certainty that always came when the truth was simple. Mrs. Redfern's death, she began, was not the result of an accident. It was not caused by natural causes, nor was it an act of deliberate malice. It was something in between. Mr. Redfern looked at her, his brow furrowed. Something in between? Yes, Miss Marple replied. It was an unfortunate mistake. The kind of mistake that happens when someone is pushed too far, too quickly. He looked down, his face pale, as though he was finally understanding the weight of what she was saying. And Caroline? he asked quietly. Did she? No, Mr. Redfern, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. Caroline did not kill your wife, but she was involved. He opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple held up her hand. Let me explain, and then you will see. Miss Marple paused, allowing the quiet of the hall to settle around them. She felt the weight of the moment, but she had no intention of prolonging it unnecessarily. The truth was now in sight, and it needed to be understood, not avoided. Caroline, she began, wanted recognition. She wanted to prove herself, to show that she was more than just your niece, more than just a shadow in your wife's life. She had ambition, and she had plans. She was going to leave, you know. She was planning to open a cafe, to make something of herself. But there was one thing standing in her way. Your wife's control. Mr. Redfern shifted uncomfortably. She hated it, didn't she? Yes, she did. But Caroline wasn't just frustrated, she was hurt. She had spent years under your wife's thumb, watching her own talents go unrecognized. And when she finally had the chance to show the village what she could do, to be noticed for something of her own, it was taken away. It wasn't just the cake, Mr. Redfern. It was the recipe, the recognition, the chance to claim something for herself. He swallowed hard. And what did she do? Miss Marple's voice was calm, her words measured. Caroline had an idea, a plan, really. She would give your wife the recipe, but in a way that would make it her own. She would give it to her, but with the subtle threat that it would be used to make her irrelevant. Caroline's ambition had always been to be seen as the creative force behind the marmalade and the cake. If your wife would only step aside, if she would let her take credit, then things would be different. But she didn't mean for it to go this far. Mr. Redfern's voice was thick with emotion. She didn't mean to. Miss Marple nodded. No, she never intended for it to end the way it did. It was an accident. She wanted to frighten your wife, to push her into acknowledging her, to show her that the world could move on without her. But your wife's health wasn't strong. The stress of the confrontation, the realization that things were changing, it was too much. Your wife collapsed unexpectedly and died. Mr. Redfern sat down, his face ashen. So it was all a mistake? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. But it was a mistake built on years of quiet resentment, of unnoticed brilliance. Caroline wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to reclaim what she thought had been stolen from her. The right to be seen, the right to be known for her work. Mr. Redfern's eyes darkened. And what now? What happens to her? That is for you to decide, Miss Marple replied. But the truth has to come out. Not just for the sake of justice, but for Caroline's sake as well. She needs to understand that this has gone too far, and perhaps, just perhaps, she needs to understand that her talent isn't something that can be stolen. It can only be earned. Mr. Redfern took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done. Miss Marple smiled gently. No need for repayment, Mr. Redfern. Justice, after all, is its own reward. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. Your wife, she said softly, wasn't a villain. She was just a woman who didn't know how to share what she had. And now perhaps you and Caroline can both learn from that. And with that, Miss Marple left the Redfern house, knowing that the truth had been laid bare. In the simplest, most devastating way. The village would move on, of course. It always did. But for Mr. Redfern and Caroline, nothing would ever be the same again.